আজকে ৫ই মে কার্ল মার্কসের ১০৪তম জন্মদিন। আজকে আমাদের ভারতের ছাত্র ফেডারেশন যাদবপুর বিশ্ববিদ্যালয় আঞ্চলিক কমিটির পক্ষ থেকে আমরা একটা আলোচনা সভার আয়োজন করেছি। তো এই আলোচনা সভায় আমরা কথা বলবো, কথা শুনবো অধ্যাপক প্রভাত পট্টনায়কের থেকে। ব্যাক টু মার্কস, এটা আমাদের আজকের বিষয়। মানে মার্কসে আমাদের ফিরে যেতে হবে। তো এইরকম কথা আমরা যখন বলছি, মানে যখন আহ, তার মানে এখান থেকে একটা এরকম প্রশ্ন উঠতেই পারে, তাহলে কি আমরা মার্কসের থেকে কোথাও দূরে সরে এসেছি? তেমনটা নয়। আমরা আসলে মার্কসের কাছে এই ফিরে যাওয়াটা, এই ফেরাটা আসলে বারবার ফিরে যাওয়া, এই ফেরাটা আসলে এরকম আহ, প্রত্যেকটা বছর শুধু মার্কসের জন্মদিনে এমন নয়। আমাদেরকে আসলে প্রত্যেকটা দিনই ফিরতে হয় মার্কসের কাছে। সেই জন্যই ব্যাক টু মার্কস। তো আমাদের সাথে আছেন আমাদের আজকের বক্তা প্রভাত পট্টনায়ক। তাকে আমরা প্রথমে এখানে এইরকম সময় আমাদেরকে সময় দেওয়ার জন্য প্রথমে তাকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই। তো এইবার আমরা শুরু করব আমাদের আজকের কথাবার্তা। আমাদের আমাদের আজকে খুব একটা বলার নেই, আমাদের শোনার আছে। তারপরে আমরা প্রশ্ন, যা যা প্রশ্ন আপনারা যারা দেখছেন তারা কমেন্ট করতে পারেন, সেই প্রশ্নগুলো তারপরে আর কি স্যারের থেকে আমরা শুনবো। আহ, তো আমরা বেশি আর কথা না বাড়িয়ে সোজা চলে যাচ্ছি। আহ, আমরা শুরু করছি আজকের কথাবার্তা। আহ, আজকের বক্তা প্রভাত পট্টনায়ক। স্যার, ইউ ক্যান স্টার্ট ইউর লেকচার। ওকে।
ওকে, ধন্যবাদ। আপনারা আমায় আজ ডেকেছেন, সেই জন্য আমি কৃতজ্ঞ। আমি আমার বক্তব্যটা ইংরেজিতে রাখব। Back to Marx, while obviously the reason for choosing that topic has been explained and is a very useful concept, at the same time should perhaps be replaced by the phrase forward with Marxism. Karon, back to Marx gives the impression that Marx somehow holds the secret to our behavior, what it should be, how we should be coping with today's world, and so on, as if the person called Marx, the man called Marx, holds all these secrets, which would make Marx himself into a kind of religious figure, a sort of, you know, uh, a kind of prophet, and of course, Marx's writings into scriptures. That's not what we want. Marx was, in fact, an extremely perceptive human being who analyzed society, and what we have, and who left for us a set of concepts, a set of ideas, a set of theories with which we can, and which are open-ended. They're not closed. You see, when you look at scriptures, they're all closed. While the whole idea of Marx and Marxism is to equip us with concepts and theories which are open ended, with which we can actually analyze new situations that arise, situations that Marx himself may not even have visualized. But on the other hand, those situations can still be analyzed by looking at the concepts, looking at the theories, looking at the propositions which Marx has left for us. Now, what are these theories and propositions? First of all, a question may arise that, look, in society at any given time, there are lots of contradictions. there is an enormous exploitation, and this exploitation is of different kinds. The exploitation of labor by capital, which is what Marx was talking about, is just one particular instance. You also have, let us say, in our country, exploitation of Dalits by feudal lords, by landlords. You find gender exploitation. You find exploitation of the tribal people. And therefore, you have a multiplicity of exploitative relationships in any society at any given point of time. And some of these exploitative relationships are far greater, far more intense than the exploitation of workers by capitalists. As a matter of fact, in societies like ours, the workers employed in the capitalist sector are really somewhat better off than many of the tribal population, than many of the Dalit population, and so on. As a result, the question may arise, why do we concentrate on looking at that particular relationship of capital versus wage labor, of capitalism's exploitation of the workers, which is what Marx had analyzed? In other words, why should we think of Marxism as a way forward if it is the case that the phenomenon which Marx studied is something which in societies like ours is appears to be a relatively less significant phenomenon than many that we actually observe. And this is a point which has been raised by many people uh, who say, for instance, that look, the Marxists have got it wrong because in our society, really, it is the exploitation of the Dalits and the tribals which should be the focus of attention and not the exploitation of the working class. Of course, one part of the Marxist answer to this, which is correct. In other words, I'm not questioning that part, though that would not be my sole answer. One part of the Marxist answer to this is that look, caste and class are really not separate things in societies like ours. That basically the Dalits are also laborers. That therefore looking at the wage labor of the Dalits vis-a-vis their employers is really part of the overall analysis of capitalism. So many people use the term caste hyphen class in order to denote the fact that caste and class really are very closely, very intimately linked. And this is certainly true. I mean, absolutely, you can see that those who are the most oppressed in our society are also the ones without any means of production. They are genuinely people who really have to survive on the selling of their labor power. Admittedly, the sale of their labor power may not be to capitalists proper, it may be to landlords, it may be to other kinds of employers. All right, we should analyze that. But fundamentally, they are people who live through the sale of their labor power. So that is one part of the answer. But the part of the answer which I want to emphasize today, which I think is extremely important and not often recognized, is the following. That you see that you look at any society, that society, as I said, is marked by a lot of contradictions, is marked by exploitative relationships of various kinds, but that society does not remain frozen. That society changes from one moment to the next. If it has a certain relationship today, if it has a certain characteristic today, it has a very different characteristic tomorrow. In this movement from one state to another, there has to be a dynamic element that actually pushes society in that direction. That dynamic element all over the world today, including in our country, is capitalism. That capitalism is what pushes our society from one state to another, from one kind of existence to another. Therefore, every other exploitative relationship, whether it is gender exploitation, whether it is the exploitation of tribals, whether it is the exploitation of Dalits, is something which does not remain the same over time, but it keeps changing. And the basic motive force behind this change is capitalism. Therefore, an analysis of capitalism is central to an analysis of where our society is today and where it will be going tomorrow. And that analysis of capitalism is provided by Marx. That Marx equips us to understand the dynamic element in this entire uh, concatenation of relationships that constitutes our society. That therefore it is not that the workers are the most exploited. I mean, workers in the sense of workers employed by capital are the most exploited. It is not the case that they are the worst off. Obviously, we know the Dalits, tribals, and so on are much worse off, are in a much worse situation. But on the other hand, it is looking at the capitalist system, is looking at capitalism, is looking at this phenomenon called capitalism that actually introduces a dynamic into our society without which we cannot understand anything, including the position of Dalits today, including the position of tribals today, including the position of women today, etc. In other words, for understanding every one of these aspects, for understanding every aspect of exploitation, we need to look at capitalism in a modern context. In today's context, we need to look at capitalism. While it is, and Marx was very clear that while it is true that societies like ours had really witnessed relatively slow change over centuries, they have been witnessing very rapid change in the last few years, and they are going to witness further rapid change. And I shall be discussing some of these changes in the course of this lecture. Now, the changes that capitalism brings into societies like ours, every society, once capitalism has entered any society, it actually changes that society. And therefore, no issue can be analyzed without reference to capitalism. And if you're going to refer to capitalism, then you can do so only with the ideas of the main theorist of capitalism, that is Karl Marx, the ideas of the main person who had these insights into capitalism. Okay, now what is, you see, when I say capitalism changes societies, I mean something much more than just an empirical description. Yes, of course, it changes society. We know that. Commodity, it drags people into the relationship of commodity production. It drags people into processes of primitive accumulation of capital, whereby they lose their property, which is taken over by the capitalists, as Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital. It introduces among them destitution, so that many of them join the reserve army of labor. Capitalism does all that. But that's not enough about what Marx was saying. Marx's understanding was that capitalism does all this spontaneously. That means it does all this not consciously, without, it is in the nature of capitalism to do all this. It does all this, as I said, spontaneously. Not that anybody willed capitalism to do all this, not that even the capitalists will capitalism to do all this. As a matter of fact, Marx said that capitalism is a spontaneous system, by which I mean it's a system that moves on its own. Nobody set it up. On the contrary, because of competition between capitals, competition between workers, and so on, everybody feels compelled within capitalism to act in particular ways. If you don't act in those ways, then you get thrown out of the system, and therefore you would not even be able to survive. So you're forced to act in particular ways, because of which you don't have agency under capitalism. You see, Marx referred to the capitalists themselves as capital personified. That basically means that the spontaneous tendencies of capital manifest themselves through the behavior of capitalists. Capitalists accumulate. Why do they accumulate? They don't accumulate because they like doing so. They accumulate because they are compelled to do so. If they don't accumulate, if in this competition to accumulate, capitalists actually slacken, in that case, the capitalist who slackens would actually lose out to the others, would be thrown out, and would stop being a capitalist. Therefore, it's a system in which everybody occupies a certain position, and if you don't act in particular ways, you're thrown out of that position. And therefore, people act in ways which are, as it were, they, there is a compulsion upon them to do so. And this compulsion arises from the fact of competition. This compulsion is impersonal. Capitalism is an impersonal, coercive, spontaneous system that actually moves forward through what Marx called its own immanent tendencies. In other words, tendencies which are, as it were, intrinsic to it. And these tendencies manifest themselves. And I believe that Marx's fundamental insight was to see capitalism in this way, that even the capitalist is not the hero of the system. He is not the main actor of the system. But everybody in the dramatis personae of this system, including the capitalist, is compelled to act in particular ways, and therefore it is capital that forces them to act in particular ways. Capital is characterized by uh, an arrangement where there is competition, and this competition is the mechanism through which capital forces these people, whether it's workers, whether it is capitalists, and so on, to act in particular ways. Of course, the workers break the spontaneity of the system when they get together with other workers, overcome their competition with other workers to form what Marx called combinations like trade unions, and then politics is introduced into these combinations by outside theorists, because workers do not spontaneously develop a theoretical understanding or a socialist consciousness. That comes from outside, from persons who have studied the system, who have actually had the privilege of education and are socially sensitive, and therefore they bring uh, theory to the working class, they bring a socialist consciousness to the working class, and that is how the workers acquire this consciousness and then move on to changing the system. But fundamentally, the system in its essence is one that actually is a spontaneous system. Now, in this spontaneous system, as I said, it is a spontaneous system characterized by the working out of various immanent tendencies of capital. Now, there are several immanent tendencies that Marx discussed. Centralization of capital, that is, free competition among capitalists, gives rise to concentration that at a certain point of time then leads on to monopoly capitalism. That is centralization of capital. As Marx said, one capitalist kills many. That means many capitalists. Then the recreation of a reserve army of labor, because capitalism cannot function without a reserve army of labor. That basically the idea of full employment under capitalism is a pipe dream, and so on. There are many things that Marx talked about, but I want to talk today about just one immanent tendency of capital, which we have been noticing in our own country kind of, very clearly in the last few years. And this also underlines why we cannot understand even a society like ours, where the capitalist mode of production occupies a relatively minor space. We simply cannot understand our society without reference to capitalism. Now, this immanent tendency is the tendency of capital to encroach upon the pre-capitalist sector, particularly to encroach upon the petty production sector, by which I mean the peasants, the fishermen, the kind of, artisans, the craftsmen, and so on, the petty traders, etc. Capital encroaches on this sector, it supplants these producers, and of course, it takes over the space occupied by them. It may not take over the space immediately, it may not take over the space by simply supplanting them, as I mentioned earlier, but it may actually encroach upon the sector and turn the producers into sort of, de facto servers of the interests of capital. In other words, if capital comes and grabs hold of of a sector, reduces the producers into a subservient status, then it may not actually convert them into wage laborers, but nonetheless, they would be continuing to be exploited in a manner that wage labor tends to be. So I would simply use the neutral phrase that capitalist tendency to encroach upon the petty production sector is an extremely important component of the immanent tendencies of capital. In societies like ours, where the petty production sector is extremely large, in India, for instance, almost half the population and of the workforce is engaged in agriculture. And agriculture has a tiny capitalist sector, plantations and so on, or another tiny capitalist sector of landlords or, kulaks who have become capitalists. But those are tiny. The bulk of the capitalists, bulk of the agricultural sector is of peasants who are not kind of capitalists in any sense, but on the other hand, who nonetheless constitute petty producers, and this is as much as almost a half of our workforce. So, in societies like ours, where the capitalist sector is relatively small, nonetheless, the tendency of the capitalist sector to encroach upon petty production is so significant. In fact, I would say it is the central phenomenon of India in the contemporary times. It's so significant that we cannot understand what is happening in our society without referring to capital, without referring to the immanent tendencies of capital and how they are impinging upon the petty production sector. Now, for a very long time after independence, because of the fact that, India's independence struggle really took off in a big way in the 1930s. Now, why did it take off in a big way? Because the peasantry joined the struggle in large numbers. And the peasantry joined the struggle because of the fact that 1930s was characterized by the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, there were, the peasants got indebted, and the Great Depression carried over into the war, in which there was massive taxation of the peasantry, massive kind of deficit financing that raised prices, but those peasants who had to buy back their products therefore got hurt, and even the rise in prices benefited mainly the traders and middlemen rather than the peasantry. So the peasantry had acute distress in the 1930s, which carried over to the period of the war, which saw the massive Bengal famine of 1943, in which 3 million people died. And the point is that during the war, I mean, so during the depression, therefore, when the peasants got indebted because their prices had crashed, the independence movement took off in a big way. They all joined the independence movement in a very big way. And when they did so, one of the promises that the anti-colonial struggle made to them is that come independence, you would never again witness a situation like this. That basically independent India would protect you from this kind of a dire situation in which you find yourself. And as a result, after independence, a whole set of arrangements were put forward, if you like, to check the imminent tendency of capital to encroach upon the petty producers. There was, I mentioned earlier, landlord capitalism, kulak capitalism, but all of it was internal to the agricultural sector. Outside capitalists were not allowed to encroach on the agricultural sector. And therefore, there was no primitive accumulation of capital where, let's say, industrialists ousted the peasants and took over the land, whether, let us say, agribusiness ousted the peasants and took over their land and so on. They were insulated from agribusiness, industrialists, and the big capitalists of the towns. There was a certain capitalist tendency inside, which was relatively small, but nonetheless, they were insulated from outside. And likewise, you had protection of the peasantry from price fluctuations. They were isolated from the world market prices because of heavy protection that they enjoyed, tariff protection, quantitative restriction on imports and exports, and what is more, you had an agricultural prices commission that actually ensured that for 22 crops there was minimum support price, procurement price, and for commercial crops there were all kinds of specific commissions or boards: tea board, coffee board, rubber board, coir board, and so and so on. Similarly, the jute commission, uh, for jute there was a commission, and so on. Uh, for cotton there was similarly a set of prices which were announced and which at which cotton was procured, etc. Now, the point is, all these meant that the peasants were provided a certain amount of price support, they were provided with input subsidies, they were provided after bank nationalization with bank credit at subsidized rates. A certain proportion of bank credit had to go to the agricultural sector and so on. Now, all this, I'm not saying actually benefited all peasants. Of course not. They benefited the better off peasants, but the marginal peasants, small peasants, and so on were really excluded. Even the agricultural laborers were excluded. But at any rate, in the agricultural sector, there was no massive encroachment of outside urban capital, and particularly capital that is large. Big capital did not encroach on the agricultural sector. That changed with neoliberalism, with economic liberalization that was introduced in 1991 in particular. With economic liberalization, the immanent tendencies of capital once more were allowed to manifest themselves. In fact, the term liberalization I would define as liberalizing the immanent tendencies of capital. And basically, the kind of things capital was doing, the kind of things that the state had put some kind of a checks upon, Those checks were removed with liberalization. I would like to argue that those checks, in any case, are checks that cannot last very long. In other words, liberalization in India is, in other words, a kind of Nehruvian mixed economy in which the state tries to control the immanent tendencies of capital is something that really cannot last very long. Either capitalism breaks free of these kinds of checks and therefore the immanent tendencies show themselves, or alternatively, the state has to prevent capital from breaking free, and that would require moving more and more towards a socialist system. So you cannot have a mixed economy. You cannot have a controlled capitalism as a permanent phenomenon under capitalism, or you, yeah, as a permanent phenomenon. If you did, then there would be no need for socialism. The need for socialism arises because capitalism cannot be a controlled phenomenon, because its spontaneous tendencies manifest themselves over time in a manner that you can control for a while, but not forever. And why not is something that I don't want to go into here. Uh, okay, or if you like, one sentence that basically, all in the global sphere, centralization of capital created globalized finance capital, international finance capital that went across borders, because huge amounts of capital had got concentrated in European banks and American banks. They wanted to go all over. And when they go all over, they break up barriers, they get countries indebted to them, and when they get countries indebted to them, they put forward conditions that remove all these checks that the government has actually introduced on the functioning of capitalism, and that is something which then the governments are compelled to do. So the liberalization in India basically meant that the immanent tendencies of capital once more got a chance to manifest themselves. Not all of them went immediately because, after all, there's a public opinion, there's a political pressure, and so on. But nonetheless, the whole idea since liberalization has been to remove the immanent tendencies, remove the barriers to the immanent tendencies of capital. This is very obvious. For instance, you find that earlier, the agribusiness selling seeds, Monsanto, for instance, was prevented. The Green Revolution seeds were developed in the government's own research laboratories. But in fact, now you find the peasants being directly exposed to companies like Monsanto, to agribusiness, which sells them seeds. And while selling them seeds, it puts forward conditionalities upon them, because of which they cannot use the seeds as they like. You find that uh, banks now, supposed to show profit, have been defaulting on their priority sector lending. Very little institutional credit goes to the agricultural sector. Some does, but very little. In other words, if you look at the proportion of bank credit that goes to agriculture, this proportion keeps rising till the end of the 1980s, and after that, there is a steady fall in this proportion. Non-institutional credit is now, the major source of agricultural credit. Non-institutional basically implies some kind of a money lender relationship. Then you find that in the case of commercial crops, there is a complete abandoning of any price support. That all the tea board, coffee board, rubber board, coir board that I was telling you about, which intervened in certain periods to make sure that the peasants actually got a minimum price that they did not have to accept. Price crashes dictated from the international market. Now you find that while the boards remain, the board's marketing function or market intervention function has disappeared, and they are basically, bodies that simply are interested in promoting the sale of Indian tea or coffee in London or in New York, but they have nothing to do with supporting the Indian peasants. Similarly, you find that input subsidies have been whittled down. You find that, in the case of food grains, by the way, there was a serious effort on the part. The government was seriously considering removing the support for food grains, but there was so much opposition that the government actually prevented it. Because of all this, now you find the petty production sector is very drastically squeezed. I said the government prevented the withdrawal of support to the food grain sector, but the government at the same time has not been increasing procurement prices in tandem with other prices in the economy. I'll give you an instance. When I joined JNU, that was in 1973, I joined at a basic salary of 700 rupees per month as an associate professor in the center. Those days, the procurement price for wheat was about 75 rupees per quintal. Today, an associate professor joining JNU would be having a starting basic salary of about 50,000 rupees per month, which means it is 1 into 70. While if you look at the uh, procurement price for wheat, it has gone up from about 75 to about 1700, and 1 is to 20. Therefore, the farmers have actually uh, been shortchanged. The farmers' prices have not increased. Have 1/3 or less than a third of the rise which, let us say, professors have got is the rise that the farmers have got. That's what I mean by saying, and mind you, professors are not the most pampered section in our society, which is what I mean by saying that actually, even when procurement remained in the case of food grains, the prices did not rise. So a squeeze on the peasantry was developing over time. It was not as rapid as capital might have wished, but nonetheless it was there, because of which petty production, agricultural production, had become unprofitable, because of which debt had increased greatly, because of which you actually found a massive spate of peasant suicides. Peasant suicides of about more than 2 lakhs, which occurred over a period of about 15, 20 years, uh, is something which is the reflection of the squeeze that was being uh, imposed on the agricultural sector, on the petty production sector. After 2014, when the Modi government came to power, it completely did away with all checks, or tried to do away with all checks on the immanent tendency of capital to encroach upon petty production, including peasant agriculture. And it did so in very many different ways. Every single measure that the Modi government has adopted is an anti peasant measure. You look at demonetization. Demonetization basically meant an addition to the debt burden of the peasantry, because of the fact that they suddenly found themselves unable to sell their product, but at the same time the new sowing season had to commence, and when the sowing season had to commence, you actually found that they had to borrow for all their inputs. They had to borrow money in order to buy their inputs, and therefore their debt increased, and with the increase in debt, they remained indebted even subsequently. So demonetization was a big blow, and this is true of the other petty production sectors, like, as I mentioned, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on. So there was a push towards destitution, which occurred through demonetization of the petty production sector. You look at GST. You see, if you say that the goods and services tax, we are going to pitch the tax rates at a level where they'll be revenue neutral. That means the kind of indirect taxes that existed earlier, sales tax and so on, the amount of revenue they raised, we would try and pitch our goods and services tax at a rate where the same revenue is obtained. Now, but a lot of people who didn't pay sales tax earlier are now going to be caught under GST, and this refers to the petty production sector. Therefore, the GST plays the role of actually shifting a part of the tax burden from large capitals to small capitals or to petty producers. Consequently, the GST was a way also of squeezing the petty production sector. Uh, and finally, you have these three farm bills. The three farm bills are going to do away with the entire system of minimum support price, which has been in existence till now. The entire system. The government keeps saying that no, 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 we have no such desire to do away with minimum support price, but there's a very simple solution to it. Why don't you amend your laws to make sure that the minimum support price would continue to be in force? But that they're not willing to do. They are willing to tell you through private verbal assurance that no, 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 we are going to continue, which is basically a camouflage for the fact that the idea is to do away with the entire regime of minimum support prices. By the way, this is something which has been demanded for a very long time by imperialism and the World Trade Organization. The entire Doha round of negotiations has been stalled because WTO wants India to do away with all these price support measures. And the Indian government has been resisting it for reasons which are obvious, because this is going to be extremely unpopular. But the BJP government has actually done it. And of course, you can see the huge peasant agitation that is taking place, because they rightly say that, look, if this is carried through, then we will become agricultural laborers. When they say that, they are actually saying something that Marx had said. They're actually saying something that Marxism says. Marxism says that the tendency of capital is to displace petty producers, is to squeeze them, is to suppress them into a situation where even if they remain as petty producers, they would be tied to the will of capital at levels of living much worse than they currently have. Or if they decide to abandon it altogether, then they will become agricultural laborers. Now, this is something which Marx had said that this is something which Marxism keeps talking about. This is a proposition of Marxism, and now the country's peasants themselves, overwhelming majority of farmers, have actually come to realize through their life experience something that Marxism has been teaching for a very long time. Therefore, the relevance of Marxism in a society like ours is that we can carry forward the analysis of the unfolding socio-economic scenario by looking at the kind of, by looking at the way that the immanent tendencies of capital manifest themselves in our societies. And these tendencies of capital, above all, manifest themselves by dispossessing, squeezing the peasantry, which actually prepares the ground for the peasantry to be turned against capital, which is increasingly happening in our society. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to move away from the society, and likewise, the whole question of unemployment. I mean, unemployment is an endemic feature of capitalism. By the way, I should like to say that there is a mistaken view that, look, when capitalism takes hold. I mean, let's say capitalism is going to set up an industry. Now, that industry requires some dispossession of petty producers, dispossession of petty producers from land to set up factories, dispossession of petty producers in lieu of whose output the capitalist output would be sold, like the standard deindustrialization that happened in India over centuries. So, uh, capitalist industrialization dispossesses petty peasants. But the mistaken view is that having done so, it reabsorbs them as laborers. It doesn't. Not all of them get reabsorbed as laborers. If 100 people are thrown out of their traditional occupations, only about 20, 30, 40 may get reabsorbed. The remaining 60 or 50, in fact, do not get reabsorbed. Therefore, capital accumulation necessarily generates unemployment and large amounts of unemployment. In Europe, this phenomenon was kept in check because of large scale migration to the so called new lands of temperate settlement, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, in which they dispossessed the traditional population of Amerindians and others, got hold of their land, and set up as new cultivators and so on. But the point is that that kind of opportunity, that kind of space is not available to everybody. And of course, it's not even a very pleasant option for people to have to go and dispossess somebody else. But the point is that today, I mean, for instance, if you look at the emigration from Britain between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, the scale of that emigration relative to the British population was such that if a similar scale of emigration occurred in India, then 40 crore Indians since independence should have emigrated. Now, where would they go? As a result, firstly, it's a mistake to believe that capitalism reabsorbs everybody it displaces. On the contrary, it actually displaces many more than it reabsorbs. And secondly, this is a problem particularly relevant in countries like ours today, when capitalist industrialization simply cannot generate the kind of employment it never did, and it cannot even generate the kind of employment today, and therefore those rendered unemployed by capitalist industrialization cannot really be absorbed by capitalist industrialization in societies like ours. This has very important implications for industrial strategy in states like West Bengal or elsewhere, which I can discuss when we have discussions. But the point is that uh, because of the tendency, I have concentrated only on one tendency of capital, namely the tendency to encroach on petty production and peasant agriculture, whose outcome we are seeing in our own country today, right this moment. At the borders of Delhi, they're farmers still kind of camped, and they have camped here for months, agitating against this. And it is this that actually produces the possibility of what I would call a worker peasant alliance. In a society like ours, the workers alone can't make a revolution. By workers, I mean the workers in capitalist enterprises, the industrial workers, because they are a small proportion of the population. Therefore, what they require in order to change society is really an alliance with others who are also victims of capitalism in different ways, like the peasants have been talking about. Therefore, it creates conditions for a worker peasant alliance. Now, the idea of a worker peasant alliance was developed by Lenin, but the idea of a worker peasant alliance is already present in the writings of Marx and Engels, particularly Engels' Peasant Wars in Germany was really a study of a worker peasant alliance and what it might mean based on German history. So a worker-peasant alliance then begins to get developed, and this development then creates the conditions for movement against capitalism and the creation of a solid bloc that can actually overthrow the system, that can actually go beyond this system. When you go beyond this system, you why why go beyond this system? In other words, what is the system we need to go beyond? I mean, and what is the system we need to go to? As I mentioned, capitalism is a spontaneous system. It's a system that nobody will. It's a system that doesn't really respect anyone's particular restrictions. It doesn't respect any restrictions. It actually is a system that moves on its own steam, on its own dynamic. Its immanent tendencies manifest themselves over time. So, what you have is that for the freedom of mankind, for sustaining the material living of large segments of petty producers who can then, of course, be mobilized into forming cooperatives, into forming collectives, and so on, and improving their technology, improving their conditions of life, and so on. That's a separate matter. But they have to be protected from eviction. They have to be protected from primitive accumulation of capital. They therefore have to be protected from the immanent tendencies of capital. Therefore, the whole idea is to go from this kind of a system, which is driven by its own inner logic, into a system that has no such inner logic, a system which is amenable to the will of the people. And such a system, therefore, capitalism cannot be such a system because it is driven by the immanent logic of capital. A system that actually is therefore driven by the will of the people would be what I call socialism. If you like, in capitalism, economics drives politics because the immanent tendencies of capital basically create the kind of political atmosphere, they drive politics. Even if even if tomorrow the most revolutionary party in India came to power, unless it actually immediately did something to break the kind of stranglehold of capitalism upon this economy, it would also have to kowtow to the wishes of capital. Therefore, it would kowtow to the immanent tendencies of capital. Therefore, what you need is a system where economics drives politics to a system where the economy itself is organized, where politics drives economics, the economy itself is organized by the will of the people expressed politically through the kind of governments that they elect. And this can only be a society in which there is social ownership of the means of production, which is how we define socialism. And to bring about such a society, you require an instrument. That instrument, you require class struggle, you require people to press for change. And the core of the people pressing for change would be a worker peasant alliance. And the conditions for a worker peasant alliance are actually ripening in our own country, in our own society, which is manifest, for instance, in the kind of farmer struggle that we witness. And therefore, in our society too, we can actually look forward to a momentous change in a direction where people would strive for freedom, where we would be free of the immanent tendencies of capital, where everybody would have a certain minimum material conditions of life, where everybody would then be able to develop his or her own potential in a manner that is in keeping with that potential. I better stop there. Thank you very much. I find that there are some questions which are coming, but they're too small for me to read. If someone could read out those questions, I could answer them. All right, here is one question I can read. How would a worker peasant alliance in India look like? Caste and religious divisions are used to thwart such alliances. How to resist that? Yes, of course. At the political level, caste and religious divisions are used to thwart these alliances. But on the other hand, in other words, it's a race between, it's a tussle between the revolution and the counter revolution. You find, for instance, that the ruling party at the center is really dividing the people completely on religious lines in order to make sure that actually they cannot unite in a fight. But on the other hand, look at the other side. The BJP government in 2014 came to power on the backs of communal riots in Muzaffarnagar. They engineered communal riots, and of course, these communal riots were responsible for the whole of Uttar Pradesh being communalized. And of course, if you remember, they got so many seats from Uttar Pradesh that they actually managed to cross the halfway mark. So the BJP's rise to power was on the basis of a communal division in UP, which was particularly manifest in Muzaffarnagar, which is in western UP. Today, what you find is that the same people, or if you like, the descendants of the same people, but 7 years ago is not very much, the very same people, the Hindu Jats and the Muslim peasantry of that area in western UP are coming together in this farmers' agitation. In other words, religious differences, communal differences, which had been intensified to bring BJP to power, are now being swept aside. Similarly, you know, the division between the Jats and the Dalits has been a division for a very long time. It's an intense division. As a matter of fact, I remember in the 70s, there was a village called Kanjawala, again close to Delhi, in which there was a big movement of agricultural laborers. It was led by the CPI, and that movement of agricultural laborers really was resisted by the Jat peasants and the landlords. And it was a big tussle. So the Jats are actually the employers, the Dalits are the employees. And of course, together with this economic relationship, there's a caste relationship. Jat versus Dalit, employer versus employee. But today, you find that even the laborers are supporting the farmers' agitation. So you find that people who have been hostile to one another for decades are coming together, and this is what happens in periods of revolutionary upsurge. And I think in India, we are witnessing a period in which people are beginning to rise up. Okay, so I agree with you that of course caste and religious divisions are sought to be used to divide the people, but all I'm saying is that they don't always succeed. They don't always succeed, and whether they succeed or not depends upon us, depends upon the degree to which we can actually carry a certain consciousness to them so that they can actually be together. And this consciousness is something which is partly developing among the peasants and laborers and Hindus and Muslims in that area anyway, but it has to be strengthened by the democratic forces, by the revolutionary forces intervening to strengthen it. Okay, there is another one. All around the globe, the ill effects of capitalism are becoming more and more evident. At the same time, we are seeing consistent rise of rightist and fundamentalist forces. Is this a fallacy? Also, in a society like India, religion seems to play a bigger role than economics. How do you address that? No, you see, my point is that, these, look, the rise of religious divisions is not a separate issue. It is because the ill effects of capitalism are beginning to. Fascism everywhere arises when capitalism is in a crisis. The BJP, which is the fascist party in India, is propped up by big capital, the Ambanis, the Adanis, and so on. It is the party which is maximally funded. Therefore, what you are seeing all over the world, the two phenomena, on the one hand, the ill effects of capitalism, which is crisis ridden, mass unemployment everywhere, uh, very little growth, there's stagnation, unemployment is becoming worse and worse. People are actually, in material terms, suffering everywhere. Joseph Stiglitz, the American economist, made an estimate. According to him, if you compare the real wage of a male American worker in 1968 with the real wage in 2011, in 2011 is marginally lower. The real wage rate of a male American worker. So everywhere, the ill effects of capitalism, as you say, are becoming clear, and everywhere you find the emergence of fascist or semi-fascist forces, everywhere, including Trump in America. These two are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomena or aspects of the same phenomena. But against this, you also have to see that there is an effort. I mean, it becomes possible to mobilize large segments of the population against fascism in a direction of democracy and through that towards socialism. I'll give you one example. Biden. Okay, I mean, Biden is not a socialist, but you look at Biden's program. Biden defeated Trump. Biden is now planning to introduce a stimulus package into the economy by taxing the wealthy, by taxing the billionaires in America, which would actually generate jobs, which would actually generate employment. Now, this is typically, I'm not saying it's a socialist, I mean, it's not a revolutionary program. It doesn't visualize transcending capitalism, but it's a progressive program. Why is it that Biden is putting forward this progressive program? Because of the fact that he has no alternative. In other words, if you want to defeat fascism, then you have to mobilize people around an alternative progressive agenda. That progressive agenda is something which even Biden has to listen to, and that is the kind of progressive agenda which, as you start implementing it, the contradictions of the progressive agenda slowly would force you to move towards socialism. As I mentioned, because the capitalists are going to strike against it. The capitalists are going to say, we're not going to invest if you do this. If so, then you'd have to have state investment. So if you have to have state investment, then, or if you have to have investment by collective farms, by investment by cooperatives, and so on, all these are forms of going beyond capitalism. And they, if they're systematically pursued, would lead you to socialism. All right, there's another one. I can't understand the development of society. Like, generally, we know it was a classless society at a certain age. Then comes the slavery. Then comes the feudalism through revolution. After that comes the capitalist system or society through revolution again. But in all societies, there has been a struggle, a conflict between two classes. One is exploiter and the other is exploited. Then all say that capitalism has come through a revolution conducted by the bourgeois. But my question is, yes, what is the question? What is the question? My question is, oh, sorry. Uh, Let me see. What is mass democratic revolution? What is the difference between the democratic revolution and the bourgeois revolution? Are the two the same? Bourgeois revolution comes through the revolution conducted by the bourgeois class itself. Then India, why are they not doing it? When will it begin? Or has it already begun? Is the mass democratic revolution a process? Are we going through the mass democratic revolution? If not, then when will it start? How will it start? If we are, oh, all right. Now listen, the point is that, as I mentioned, the bourgeoisie itself at a certain point becomes worried, or let's say the leading segments of the bourgeoisie, particularly monopoly capital, gets worried that because of the crisis to which the system has entered, there would be an uprising against the system itself. And that's when the monopoly capital or the leading segments of the bourgeoisie enter into an alliance with all kinds of fascist elements to divide society along lines of race, along lines of religion, and so on. And that being the case, you find that the democratic revolution is an anti-fascist revolution in our today's context. Of course, the democratic revolution has a much deeper meaning in a society like ours. It has a meaning in terms of overcoming, let us say, caste oppression, overcoming feudalism, and so on. But on top of all that today, there is defeating the fascist elements. So, democratic revolution is simply the restoration of democracy in a society which is marked by inequalities or which is marked by the re-emergence of racist oppression, religious oppression, communal oppression, and so on, oppression of minorities. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is that capitalism today is one which cannot support the democratic revolution because capitalism itself is in a crisis where it requires a subversion of democracy. You see this in our country. By subversion of democracy, I don't mean that elections disappear or that the democratic forms completely are abandoned. They deliberately would not be. But on the other hand, the idea is to make sure that the the capitalists themselves uh, attenuate, subvert, reduce the democratic content of the polity in societies like ours. So, uh, against this, there has to be a fight to restore democracy, a fight to deepen democracy. Democracy is not a thing where we can say, yes, yes, we are a democracy. Democracy itself requires a continuous struggle towards greater and greater empowerment of the people. Socialism is not a separate thing from democracy. Socialism is, in fact, the culmination of the democratic revolution, where the democratic revolution has now become more firmly established because social ownership of the means of production actually empowers people to the maximum extent, to a far greater extent than they had been earlier. So please do not think of democracy and socialism as two separate things. Socialism is the culmination of democracy. Socialism is a society in which democracy has reached a far greater level than it has in any uh, preceding period. Now you're saying, is mass democratic revolution started and so on? You see, there is a continuous fight for a democratic revolution that is going on. So it's not a separate thing, I mean, every day when, let's say, in JNU there is a struggle that actually says that we must have freedom of thought, that is part of the democratic revolution. Democratic revolution is going on, continuously going on, and it will go on until socialism is established. The socialist revolution, as I said, is a culmination of a democratic revolution. Now, of course, in the democratic revolution, you don't only have workers and peasants. Workers and peasants, the worker peasant alliance is, of course, a core. But on the other hand, you have all kinds of elements. You have small bourgeoisie, you have other elements of the bourgeoisie, you have intelligence, all kinds of people are part of the democratic revolution. Or of the struggle for carrying democracy forward. But on the other hand, many of them at a certain point might drop out. Many of them may get converted to the idea that yes, socialism is essential for carrying this forward. But the point is that therefore the democratic revolution passes through all kinds of phases. But on the other hand, precisely through these phases, it moves towards socialism. Okay, so I would really suggest that that don't think of formulae like mass democratic revolution. When does it begin? Or what happens? So no, democracy is a continuous struggle that is going on, and that struggle would lead on to socialism. That's not a separate thing. Okay. What are the other questions? There had been many more questions, but I'm not kind of seeing them now. One minute. Yeah. Democracy as we know it, democracy as we know is a bourgeois democracy. So is socialism a culmination of that bourgeois democracy, or is democracy, or the democracy that comes with a revolution? Yes, democracy as you see, let me put it this way. When we say bourgeois democracy and socialist democracy, what is the difference between the two? Okay. What I'm trying to say is that, don't think of bourgeois democracy as separate democracy and socialist democracy as separate democracy. That, the democracy itself is restricted by bourgeois property. Democracy itself in a capitalism is restricted. That's why we call it bourgeois democracy. You see, democracy is something which means it's a process of empowering the people. That process of empowering the people is restricted because of the existence of bourgeois property, and even more so because of the existence of monopoly property, and even more so under fascism. Okay, but the point is that that fighting against that restriction, carrying democracy forward. When I say carrying democracy forward, where the restrictions placed by bourgeois property are overcome, is when democracy, we say, becomes socialist democracy. Therefore, democracy is restricted by capitalism. Overcoming the restrictions of democracy requires the overcoming of capitalism. Full flowering of democracy really requires, therefore, the ushering in of socialism. Think of it that way. Putting it differently, don't think of it as, okay, today we have a bourgeois democracy. One day there would be a revolution, people are going to rise up, and next day we are going to have socialist democracy. No, the fight for democracy, the fight for deepening democracy, the fight for removing the restrictions upon democracy is itself a fight for a socialist revolution. Because under socialism alone would you find that the restrictions on democracy go. Therefore, do not also think of socialism as only in some sense related to the economic lives of the people, that workers and peasants will come together only when economic conditions have become bad, and that is when there would be a revolution, and then that revolution would establish socialist democracy. No. The point is that defense of bourgeois democracy is an important step, or an important part of the process that leads towards a socialist revolution. Why is it that we were opposed to the emergency? The defense of bourgeois democracy is essential. We have to defend and deepen the democracy that we find in our country, and this process of deepening would take it beyond its bourgeois constraints. What about some other questions? No other questions?